Okay. Let's see if this is going. Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to our meeting tonight. Thank you for braving the cold and struggling for a parking space. It's quite important that you came here because we're in the middle of an important and wonderful discussion right now. As you know, just 2 weeks from today, on March 19th, millions of people are going to be in the streets in the world's major cities, from Seoul to Paris, from Mexico City to Rutland, Vermont, and to here in Hartford, where we're going to have one of the largest anti-war demonstrations to occur for in some time. We'll be marching to end the occupation of Iraq, and significantly for those of you who are here tonight, we'll be marching to end the occupation of Palestine. Now, there was a time when the anti-war movement might have avoided bringing the two occupations so directly, bringing them together so directly in a protest movement, but that time has passed in a pretty dramatic way. There are several reasons for this. One is that the incredible brutality of the Sharon government against the last Intifada was televised for the world. The apartheid wall has been on the front page of the New York Times. And most recently, we've had the hard cop, soft cop routine of the Israeli defense minister and Dick Cheney preparing us all for an attack on Iran. And the dibs are up about who's going to launch that assault. But that's not the only thing that's changed. That is, the face of the Israeli government being more widely seen is not the only thing that has changed. One of the other things that has changed is that since this Intifada began, many more of us have had direct human contact with a whole layer of heroic Israeli activists, soldiers who have refused to serve in the occupied territories, journalists who have struggled to report the truth in Haaretz, women activists who stood at the checkpoints monitoring the behavior of the troops. And we've also begun to hear in the United States about Israeli groups like Kav La'aved, who's fighting to defend guest workers inside Israel, organizations like the Workers' Advice Center that's organizing to defend the rights of Arab and Mizrahim workers inside Israel who are suffering a very brutal attack by a new neoliberal economic policy by the Israeli government. But especially we've had more and more contact and more understanding of the work of figures like Jeff Halper, who's with us here tonight, who tirelessly organizes projects to help build bonds of community and political solidarity between Israeli and Palestinian activists. And I know Jeff because 2 summers ago I organized a labor solidarity mural project in Israel-Palestine and took a labor delegation to Israel-Palestine to meet with trade unionists on both sides of the Green Line. And it was Jeff Halper's organization, Rebuilding Homes, that took those labor activists in a bus and showed them the facts on the ground and prepared them to come back and argue this issue inside their own labor movement. Now, one of the participants in that labor delegation is a member of the key sponsoring group for this event. I'm from Connecticut United for Peace, which is the main statewide anti-war organization. We're endorsing it, as is the American Friends Service Committee, as is the Middle East Crisis Committee, the Right to Return Coalition, and so forth. But the main organization behind this event is We Refuse to Be Enemies. And to introduce Jeff Halper is part of my labor delegation and a staunch participant in We Refuse to Be Enemies, Sam Goldberger.
Good evening. First, by the way, I'd like to express my thanks to Rabbi Donna Berman and the Charter Oak Cultural Center for letting us come here this evening. I think it's wonderful we're in this historical Jewish venue. Let me say a little bit about the sponsoring group, we refuse to be enemies. Just after the beginning of the last Intifada, nearly 5 years ago, some Jews and Muslims in Connecticut came together, people who knew each other and who did not want to be enemies. And two of the members of our group launched our venture with an op-ed, which appeared in the Hartford Courant, stating our principles and the principles we have not departed from about advocating peace and justice and coexistence of Israel and the Palestinian nation. And we have tried to keep together and stay active. And this part of that effort that we're having Dr. Halper here tonight. It was my privilege to meet him in Israel in a venture that he organized. He is, by the way, the coordinating director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, or ICAD. Many people don't know because the media say nothing about it in the United States, but the 25% of all the Palestinian homes that have been demolished by bulldozers paid for by the American taxpayer in the last 4 years, 25% of them have nothing to do with terrorist acts or security threats. Of course, demolishing a family's home because someone in the family committed a criminal act, that's illegal under international law. But these demolitions that we're talking about here weren't even in any way have anything to do with illegal activities. It's just that the state of Israel has planned certain areas, reserved certain areas of the occupied territories for Jewish settlement, and has made it impossible for Palestinians who live in those areas to build houses. And they can stand on their heads, get all the lawyers they want, go through every possible legal process, and they simply are denied building permits on land which they own, which they live on. And if they go ahead and build anyways, as many of them do, then sooner or later demolition orders arrive and the houses are demolished. I met Jeff Halper in the Arab town of Anata, which is just outside of Jerusalem in the West Bank. There's a family headed by Salim and Arabia Shawamri who had built 4 houses on the same site and had them all demolished. And poor Arabia had a nervous breakdown after one of those demolitions. And then he got together, Salim Shawamri, who does speak English, many Palestinians don't, got together with ICAD and offered to let ICAD build a center on his land for exhibits about housing demolitions. And I was one of some international volunteers who showed up there. Most of the work was done by Palestinian construction workers. There also were Israeli volunteers. I remember one Israeli draft dodger was there with us. And we all lived well together in real brotherhood, working on the construction of that house for several weeks. And we had wonderful, intense discussions in the evening. And we had quite a feast when the construction of the house was completed. And a month later, a demolition order arrived, but because of international publicity about that, the house is still standing. And meanwhile, Jeff Halper has continued his activities. He moved to Israel from the United States in 1972. He had been a civil rights activist before going, and after arriving in Israel, he continued being an activist, and he continues today. There is plenty of cause for activism both in Israel and in the United States these days. He is not only the director of ICAD, He also directs an extensive program of international advocacy. He's the author of a book called Between Redemption and Revival, The Jewish Yeshuv in Jerusalem in the 19th Century, published in 1991. He has a recent popular book, Obstacles to Peace, and there's a forthcoming work from Pluto Press called An Israeli in Palestine, Reframing the Israel-Palestine Conflict. He is a professor of anthropology who has taught at Haifa and Ben Gurion universities, and has a wife and 3 children. With no further ado, Dr. Jeff Halper.
Well, it's good to be here in Hartford. On the one hand, it's nice to come to places and you know half the audience. It begins to make me think a little bit that maybe we try to widen our circles a little bit. But it's very nice to see a lot of people that I've known and worked with and so on. What I'd like to do tonight is I have sort of two agendas in a way. One is to kind of review with you where we are in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where we are, and I think the very dangerous and perilous times that we're about to go into in the next few months. What I'd like to do is put it in a context that I call reframing. Now, George Lakoff caught up with me, and that's become a buzzword, so everybody thinks that I'm George's protege or something. But I think that this is something we've worked on for quite a while. But I think it's very important. It is probably important also in terms of work against Iraq, or any way of getting out of the usual mindset or the usual frame that people are educated into. And the problem is, I think, so anyways, I'll take our case, but I think you can apply it to others as well. The problem that we face is that Israel has succeeded in framing the conflict according to its terms. And the Israeli conflict, as we'll talk about in a minute, is defined according to security and terrorism, which of course is the huge buzzword, in which Israel is the victim, and there is no occupation. The word occupation is not mentioned at all. As a matter of fact, if you say the word occupation in Hebrew in Israel, people it's not a kind of a word that you normally insert into a conversation. And that kind of a framing is very powerful because it leads you to a particular set of conclusions. So when Israeli PR people or journalists, from small towns in Connecticut, or members of Congress or others come to speak on the issue, they're speaking from within the Israeli framing. It fits, it makes sense, it's what they know, and they don't see any problem with it. And the problem is that unless we come with a reframing of our own, we end up being very defensive, you can't argue from within another person's framework. If you let the other party, define the terms, set the parameters of the discussion, in a normal case, that party wins because you've determined the logic of the flow of the discussion, and it leads to your conclusions. And the other person that doesn't really have time ends up being defensive, rebutting, ends up sometimes denying things or saying things that they really don't mean, and you really can't do it. Normally, you would lose. Now, in the matter of the Kerry-Bush debates, you had that was Kerry's great mistake, I think, is that he let Bush define the terms of the discussion. Kerry had no reframing at all of his own. In a normal situation, Bush would have won the debates. The fact that he succeeded in framing the discussion and still lose, it says more about him than about Kerry, I think. But at any rate, that's, I think, a real issue, because unless you do a reframing, it doesn't really make sense to people. what you're trying to get at. So what I'd like to do is suggest to you a reframing, a way to understand the conflict, and through that also we can understand the conflict a little more, and then we'll have time for questions and discussions and all that. Okay? So there's three aspects of this reframing. I don't know, can people see this from everywhere? It's kind of it's not widescreen. I don't know. Hassan, can you see that? There's really three issues of reframing of this conflict that are really important. One is the issue of exclusivity that isn't discussed openly. The second is the conflict itself. How do you present and see and interpret the conflict itself? And the third are the solutions that you arrive at. What underlies the conflict, I believe, and what's become accepted as a part of the Israeli framing that isn't articulated, but people have internalized it fits well, is this idea of exclusivity. That in Israel's framing of the conflict, the land of Israel belongs exclusively to the Jewish people. And that's something that simply makes sense to a lot of people. People say, yeah, the Jewish people never had, has a homeland, needed a homeland, and went back. Israel should be Jewish. And that contains a lot of elements that underlie the conflict and really prevent the emergence of the solution to the conflict. But I think that this is something that really has to be challenged and has to be understood. Because Israel presents itself as a Western democracy. That's one reason in which, Bush and a lot of the others can identify so much with Israel, because it's like our country in the Middle East, the only democracy in the Middle East and so on. But it isn't a Western democracy. Zionism is a form of nationalism that came out of the late 19th century, but it came out of Eastern Europe. It's very, very different from the nationalism that you have in the United States or that you have in Western Europe. In the West, you've got a kind of a civic nationalism. In other words, it's a state-based nationalism in which you have a state and you have a body of citizens. You have a civil society, and you can join the society. You can be an immigrant. You can get citizenship. You can become an accepted part of the society. Those states are pluralistic. They're not territorial-based, but they're based on the idea of citizenship. Now, we know that in all societies, including this one, there's a lot of racism. I mean, it's not as rosy and great as I'm presenting it, but those are sort of the rules of the game. So if somebody gets up and says, America belongs to white Christians, that person might get a certain following, but in terms of the rules of the game, the way most people understand them, that's racism. That's racism. It goes counter to the concept of a liberal democracy. In Eastern Europe, and think about Serbia, Poland, Russia, places like that, the nationalism is a kind of a tribal nationalism. It's tribal. It's based on the idea of turf, of our territory. This is our territory, and nobody else has a right to be here. If we have a minority group, one reason, for example, why the Jews were persecuted for so many centuries is that they were really the only minority group in Eastern Europe. They didn't fit in within these exclusive national frameworks that you had in Eastern Europe. And so, in Eastern Europe, you've got this idea of a territory that belongs to a tribe. It's ours, exclusively. And nobody else has a right to be here. And we either have to purify it, or if we allow other people to live in our territory, they do so by sufferance and not by right. And I want to suggest to you that I think is one of the underlying elements in the conflict. That Israel is incapable of allowing a viable sovereign Palestinian state to emerge
emerge because of this idea that this entire country, from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, is ours. And there is no other people. You know, until today, I would submit, until today, the Israeli people and governments have not recognized the Palestinians. I mean, they see there's a bunch of Arabs around. Once in a while, we don't even use the word Palestinian very often. We talk about Arabs in a very undifferentiated way. Once in a while, we talk about Palestinians as kind of a contrast to Israeli Arabs, let's say. But there has never been in Israel, all through its history, going back to the beginning of Zionism at the start of the 20th century, a recognition and acknowledgement that there is another people living in this country. Another collectivity, a nation that has legitimate rights and claims to the country. That very basis of any kind of negotiation is missing. And I would submit to you that in Oslo, in the brightest days of Oslo, you never ever had negotiations. Israel never considered the Palestinians an equal partner sitting across the table and negotiating. So that I think that this is a very important thing. It's not said explicitly, but it's embedded in, it's implicit in the Israeli framing. And of course, the other side of the coin of that is that the Arabs reside in our country by sufferance and not by right. And so, if they shut up and they behave themselves and they're not uppity, they can continue to live with us. But if they raise their heads, and that expression comes from the Bible, and it has to do with the way the Israelites looked at the people of Nablus, actually. The people of Nablus were famous for being these stubborn Canaanites. They kept raising their heads, and the Israelites had to keep knocking them down. If these people keep raising their heads and challenging our claim to the land, then we have to disabuse them of that illusion that they have a right to be. And I would submit to you even that you can't explain the ferocious way in which Israel put down the Intifada, this last Intifada, the last 4 years, the absolutely disproportionate use of massive military power against basically a civilian population that didn't pose a threat nearly as great as the response. You can't explain that ferocious reaction on the basis of security, on the basis of a threat, on the basis of a military need. That, and Sharon says this every day, we're going to beat the hell out of the Palestinians until they get the message. And what is the message? The message is that this is our country. And once you accept that, and you don't have to acknowledge it, but you have to submit to the parameters of what we're going to give you, then you can live here. Otherwise, we put you on notice, you could be transferred out of the country. The Palestinians are not a side in this conflict. The country belongs to one people, and there's only one people from the Israeli point of view that has the right to decide what's going to happen there. And therefore, I'm saying there is no other people that has a legitimate claim or right to the land. And of course, there's no occupation. You can't occupy your own country. So you can imagine trying to get into a political discussion with Israelis in which there's no Palestinians, there's no conflict, and there's no occupation. What do you talk about? Well, you end up talking about terrorism. And terrorism then fills the vacuum and becomes the topic, as we'll see in a second. In our framing is alternative, what I call human rights framing. Because, I mean, the language of human rights hasn't really come to the United States yet. It's interesting, even in the left, in the States, the language of human rights isn't used nearly as much as it is in Europe. And I think that's a pity, because I think the human rights language is very rich, it's very compelling, and it would really help to set an alternative framework. To frame the opposition to the war in Iraq in human rights terms makes it even more compelling, I think, in understanding it. And human rights, of course, is universal. And so you don't have privilege or exclusivity or disparity. It levels the playing field. So in the human rights framing, there are two peoples residing in Israel-Palestine. And even the terms are interesting. An Israeli would never, ever in the world think of saying Israel-Palestine. I mean, to put the Palestinian component in, it's something it wouldn't make any sense. It wouldn't occur to you to do something like that. So even the language, the land of Israel, which is an exclusive term, versus the term that most of us use today, which is Israel-Palestine, that says a lot about what possibilities exist for resolving the conflict. So in our framing, there are two peoples that reside in Israel-Palestine, and each has a right to self-determination. In terms of the conflict, in Israel's security frame, in the security frame that emerges them, because you've taken out all the political elements, very much like the American discourse has after 9/11. You depoliticize, and all that's left is security. So in Israel's security framing, Israel is fighting for its existence. Okay? It's a little country fighting for its existence. The conflict is a win-lose proposition. And either we win or they win. So that right away, it's a zero-sum game. And of course, if Israel's fighting for its existence, and this is very much the Guantanamo discussion, and human rights go out the window. International law, I mean, those are nice things. Those are the icing on the cake. But if we're fighting for our existence, what, you want us to act according to human rights covenants or international law? Those are luxuries. And that's what this whole idea that we're fighting for our existence is what allows us to avoid the accountability of international law. And therefore, Israel's policies are based solely on concerns for security. We don't want to occupy. We don't want to harm the Palestinians. They brought it on themselves. I mean, many people ask me all the time, after what the Jews have gone through, how can they do this to another people? How can they demolish homes, 12,000 homes since 1967? How can they impoverish people? How can they do all the terrible things that the occupation involves? And the issue is that the Israeli people are convinced that everything we do, our government does is for security. And therefore, we're off the hook. I'm very sorry that we had to demolish your house, but you brought it on yourself because you became a security threat. It's depoliticized, of course, and then it allows me to do with impunity anything I want to do because you're the perpetrator. You're to blame, not me. That what comes out of this is that the Arabs don't want peace. The Palestinians are our enemies. I think these are absolute iron rules, iron assumptions, both in the Israeli government and the Israeli military establishment and among the Israeli public. And therefore, the problem is Arab terrorism. That's the problem. We boiled everything down, eliminated everything else. That's the problem is Arab terrorism. This sounds familiar. You know, it is. And, of course, in this whole discussion, there is no occupation. Not only does Israel deny it has an occupation, formally, but the word occupation is absolutely cut out of the discussion. So you can listen to Israeli television, radio for weeks and weeks and weeks, which is sometimes very political and always arguing, and never ever hear the word occupation. So this is the Israeli framing that's really very, very compelling. It makes a lot of sense, and leads you to a certain set of conclusions. In our alternative human rights framing that we try to propose, the occupation is at the center of the discussion. And I won't get into a discussion with somebody until the occupation is at the center of the discussion. Because if it isn't, if there's no occupation, what am I going to talk about? And they're going to define the discussion. So the occupation is at the center, and it's proactive. This is what I want to talk about in a minute. It's not, the occupation policies do not derive from security concerns, they don't derive from self-defense, they don't derive even from defense against terrorism, they're proactive. Israel's policy of building settlements, of annexing the West Bank, of controlling the entire country is a proactive policy that has nothing to do with issues of security. Israel is not going to fight for its existence. And this is something that we have to, that if we can get away from this, I think, then it opens up all kinds of new possibilities for discussion. We have to remember that the Palestinians have recognized Israel several times, including, and until today, they've never unrecognized Israel, within the 1949 armistice plans. In other words, within what we call the Green Line. Or the Palestinians have given up political claim to 78% of the country, which is Israel, inside the 1949 armistice plans. And the Arab League, and this has to do with the Saudi initiative of April 2002, the Arab League hasn't even extended recognition to Israel. And has said that if Israel gives up its occupation, it will not only have peace, it will not only be recognized, but it will be integrated into the region. And this was a serious enough offer that it's included in the terms of reference of the roadmap. So that even the United States takes this offer very seriously. So that Israel is not going to fight for its existence. On the contrary, it's been recognized, not only by the Palestinians, but by the wider Arab world. That terrorism is unacceptable is certainly a part of our framing. But the advantage of a human rights framing is, again, that it's universal. You can't be selective. So you can say, yes, terrorism is unacceptable. Terrorism is a problematic word. And one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Amnesty International does not use the word terrorism. They've come up with very strong reports criticizing attacks against civilians, but they don't use that word, which they feel is a loaded word. Instead, they couch it in human rights language. It is prohibited to attack or harm or kill non-combatants, civilians. Now, once you begin to adopt that kind of a language, then not only is terrorism from below condemned, non-state terrorism, but also terrorism from above, which is state terrorism. And here you've got to say to people, okay, if you're opposed to terrorism, then you've got to be opposed to the demolition of houses. To demolish 12,000 houses of innocent people, that's not terrorism. To bomb an apartment building in Gaza with a 1-ton bomb from an Apache helicopter, that's not terrorism. So that it gives us the ability to begin to set a wider parameter to the discussion. And finally, as the strong party, Israel is the occupying power. As a strong party, then, Israel must be held accountable for its actions in international law and politically. Those are some of the frameworks of this reframing that I think are important. And what I want to do is just kind of show you the way in which the occupation has become proactive. The way in which Israel has attempted to annex the occupied territories. Israel has laid over the occupied territories, and especially the West Bank and East Jerusalem, what I call a matrix of control that has 5 elements to it. One are what we call areas A, B, and C. I'm not going to get into detail on all the arcane, weird realities we live in. It's absolutely insane, but that's what we live in. During the Oslo peace process, the West Bank, which is an area about the size, the West Bank and Gaza, which is an area about the size of Delaware, so it's smaller than Connecticut, were divided into what we call areas A, B, and C. To make a long story short, the Palestinian Authority supposedly has authority over Area A, which is the dark brown areas here. Now, Israel is present in all of Area A. There is no place today without Israeli troops. So it's a fiction. But it's important for Israel to maintain the fiction of Palestinian sovereignty in Area A, because it's Area A that forms the contours of what Israel wants to be a Palestinian state. Now, I've just talked about exclusivity, and that Israel wants to control the entire country. Where does the Palestinian state come from? It comes from the fact that even though Israel views this country as one unit, and even though through its settlement enterprises, these little blue dots on the map are all settlements, about 200 settlements that have been established, that de facto make this one country, Israel can't go the next stage and in fact declare this whole country Israel. Because there's almost 4 million Palestinians in the occupied territories. So if Israel would give them citizenship, being the only democracy in the Middle East, it would cease to be a Jewish state. Because half the population of this country, if we take the country again from the Mediterranean to the Jordan, half the population is Palestinian today, before the return of refugees. So that you can't give them citizenship because then it won't be a Jewish state. On the other hand, if you don't give them citizenship, but keep them under occupation forever, permanently, if this becomes a permanent situation, then it's outright apartheid. And even in Bush's world, it's not so easy to sell apartheid these days. So what do? I would submit that Israel's approach is exactly the same as South Africa in the time of apartheid. And that is, you set up a Bantu state. You set up a mini-state, a little mini-state, in which you can shove all the Palestinians into these islands, close them up, say, okay, that's your state, you're off our hands, and then Israel annexes the rest of the country. So the first element in this matrix of control is areas A and B, which are sort of semi-ruled by Palestinians, but de facto ruled by Israel, and area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, which is under full Israeli control. So we might say, just to put this in a certain perspective, that the West Bank and Gaza are 22% of the country, of a small country. Okay? It's divided, they're divided into 64 different islands. Areas A and B and other little islands are about 64 islands. So that we can say that after 7 years of negotiations, between 1993 and 2000, all the Palestinians eked out of Israel was 18% of 22%. And that in all these little islands. So that if we know the map, if we look at the facts on the ground, we get a much better sense of Israeli intentions and what's going on than simply by listening to different declarations. The second element in the matrix of control is the closure, what we call the closure. Now, when the Oslo peace process began, if there was anything that Shimon Peres, who was the big economic man in the process, and Arafat agreed on, was that there had to be an economic dividend from the peace process. Unless the Palestinian people could see economic benefits from the process, it would be very hard for Arafat to settle. And yet, at the very beginning of the process, Israel imposed a closure. There was no particular rise in violence. There was no objective reason for that. There was no closure during the first intifada. But we get into the Oslo peace process, and then Israel imposes a double closure. One aspect of it is that Palestinians were progressively locked out of the Israeli economy. It was an increasingly stringent permit system, so that today almost no Palestinians can work in Israel. Very, very few. At the same time, we have to remember that between 1967 and 1993, Israel de-developed the occupied territories. It destroyed the agriculture. 1 million olive and fruit trees have been uprooted or cut down since 1967. 1 million. Because of the closure, because Palestinian business people weren't able to guarantee the delivery of their goods, Palestinian businesses and industries weren't able to develop. Israel wouldn't allow the Palestinians to open a bank. So that the West Bank and Gaza today are at scorched earth. 70% of the Palestinians live on under $2 a day today. They're kept from starvation by international relief agencies. There is no economy whatsoever. So on the one hand, Israel locked the Palestinian workers out of Israel, but on the other hand, they had no economy of their own to fall back on. And then Israel discovered, at the same time, a cheaper source of labor, and that is foreign workers from Romania, the Philippines, China, Thailand, West Africa. So the rule of thumb in the construction trade is that you can get 2 Romanian workers for the price of 1 Palestinian. Because you can bring them in, you can pay them less than minimum wage, you can shove them all into a little hut and charge them $2 a month rent each. You can really exploit them, and they're much cheaper than Palestinians. So you had that form of closure. And then you've got an internal closure within the West Bank. You see all these triangles here on the map represent permanent checkpoints. I got a fancy thing here. Now I feel like a professor. You see, all these triangles represent permanent checkpoints. And what's interesting to look at is that these checkpoints are not along the border necessarily, but they're clustered inside. You see, in between all the islands. So that what Israel is really doing in this internal closure is preventing the movement of Palestinians from island to island. The idea being, I believe, to lower their expectations. That each island becomes a world in and of itself. You marry in the island, you do your business in the island, you live within that island, and it lowers expectations so the Palestinians over the years give up the idea that they'll ever get the entire West Bank. And they'll settle, if you can connect up a few islands, wow, it's like a whole new world has opened up. So the closure is a very important part of getting the Palestinians to internalize the fragmentation of their territory, and in the end to accept the Bantustan that Israel will offer. And this is also where house demolitions come in, because most of the house demolitions are done, these lines of Area A are drawn very tightly around the major Palestinian population centers, so that you own land in Area C. That's the land you farm. That's the land to give to your sons when they get married and want to have houses of their own. So by preventing Palestinians from building here and pushing them back into these islands, again, Israel is able to get the Palestinians to internalize the Bantustan on the way. The third element of the matrix of control are the settlement blocks. Israel, as I said, has about 200 settlements. Most of the settlements are little tiny settlements of fanatical religious Jews who believe in the greater land of Israel, way up in densely populated Palestinian areas that Israel anyway wants to give up. So that what Israel has done is it's defined in terms of settlement blocks, those settlements that it wants to keep, and then the settlements that it's willing to give up. These pink areas are the settlement blocks that Israel wants to keep. So we have to talk about settlement blocks, not just about settlements. Because if Israel has 200 settlements, it could give up 150 settlements, 160 settlements, and still keep the major settlement blocks it is in control. So if we don't know the map and the facts on the ground, it's hard to evaluate, is this a real thing, or are they pulling the wool over our eyes? So that Israel has 7 settlement blocks that it wants to keep. The Jordan Valley, what's called the Ariel block, that divides the West Bank east and west, and it's around the city of Ariel, which also sits atop the largest water aquifer on the West Bank. There are 2 major sources of water for Palestinians. One is the Jordan River, that they have no access to at all, and the other is this large aquifer here under the Ariel block that they also don't have access to. So the Palestinians in the end get about 20% of the water of the country for their needs. Settlers use on the average 5 times more water per capita than is allocated to Palestinians. Then there's a block that goes down like this. It's called the Modi'in block. Because right here is the city of Modi'in that's being built as the largest city in Israel. It straddles the green line here, the city that's like the anchor of this area, and that connects up then to the 3 settlement blocks that make up what we call Greater Jerusalem. Greater Jerusalem is very important, and 2 months ago the government tabled in the parliament its master plan for Greater Jerusalem. So this is being done. As a matter of fact, Israel just announced last month the building of a new city right here between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. A whole new settlement city. So that the Greater Jerusalem is important because, first of all, it again divides the West Bank east and west. So now we're starting to create 1 island, 2 islands, 3 islands, plus Gaza, plus East Jerusalem, which is being disconnected from the West Bank. The wall is being built around East Jerusalem to isolate it. So we're talking about a Bantustan of at least 5 islands. Okay? And the Greater Jerusalem area divides the West Bank in half, but it also isolates Jerusalem from the rest of the Palestinian state. Even if, if there's some agreement that the Palestinians have a right to drive into Jerusalem or something like that, Jerusalem accounts for 40% of the Palestinian economy. This is where tourism is. Jerusalem is the economic core, the heart of a Palestinian state. If you take away Jerusalem, the state has absolutely no economic viability of its own. So it's extremely important to integrate East Jerusalem into the Palestinian state, which is exactly what these settlement blocks here are intended to prevent. So you're talking about a state whose economic heart is taken out, and what these settlements also do is they fragment East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem was developing as a Palestinian city. Organically, it was moving up towards Ramallah and moving down towards Bethlehem. Now it's divided into all kinds of little ghettos, little enclaves, and so you have the fragmentation there. And then finally, there's a settlement block coming up the Hebron. Now, Israel's, and this is where I'm saying we're at a very dangerous junction right now. If we look at what's happened since 1967, or maybe even since 1977, when the Begin government was elected and Sharon became the architect of the settlement enterprise, we see a kind of a 3-stage strategy that Israel has for creating the Palestinian Bantustan. One is to establish the facts on the ground. Massive facts on the ground that are irreversible. There are today almost 500,000 Israelis living across the 1967 border in the occupied territories. They're living in cities, and when we say settlements, it kind of brings up an image that really minimizes what we're talking about. We're talking about cities of 70,000 people, 50,000 people, and cities that are being connected up now. We're connecting the dots into these settlement blocks. So that what Israel believes, where we've got to, is that in a way the Israeli controlling presence has become irreversible. There is no power in the world that is going to make Israel withdraw to the 1967 border. And certainly not the United States. Now, the second element of this, with the facts on the ground, is, even if we have facts on the ground, if Sharon would have left office with only the facts on the ground, but it's still an occupation. An occupation is defined in international law as a temporary military situation. So the job would have been left unfinished. There was always the danger that, the international community could really make Israel roll the occupation back. So in April, and most Americans don't know this, I guess Fox missed it that night, but in April, you had the Bush-Sharon exchange of letters. Sharon came to the White House. Sharon has visited the White House more than any other leader in the world, including Blair. And they had an exchange of letters in which the American government formally, in writing, recognized these settlement blocks as a part of Israel. They said Israel does not have to go back to the 1967 lines, the Green Line, which undermines UN Resolution 242, which was the very basis of the two-state solution. That Israel doesn't have to go back to these 67-49 borders, and that the settlement blocks are a recognized part of Israel. They're out of negotiations. Now, Bush didn't call them settlement blocks. He called them Israel's major population centers. And this agreement to annex, basically, and the Palestinians, of course, were outraged. Palestinians said, what right does Bush have to give 30% of the West Bank to Israel? And what if we had a meeting in Ramallah, we decided, California goes back to Mexico? I mean, what right does Bush have to give 30%, because the settlement blocks are 30% of the West Bank? Give it to Israel. But that was done. Not only was it done, but it was ratified by Congress in June, in the House by a vote of 407 to 9. So we're talking overwhelmingly bipartisan. And I'd be very surprised if your member of Congress didn't vote that way. And it was approved the next day in the Senate by a vote of 95 to 3. So that's Israel's trump card, is Congress. And now the fact that the facts on the ground have been recognized as a permanent political fact. So in a way, Sharon succeeded in transforming the occupation into an accepted political fact, accepted by the United States, which is all Israel cares about. It doesn't care about Europe and the UN and so on. Now, the third stage is before us. And that's what's going to happen in the next few months. The third stage is we've got to find the quisling leader, the collaborator that's going to sign off on this. South Africa could not have established this guy unless it found some guy that said, yeah, I'm willing to be president, and signed off on it. Arafat didn't play that role. We know what happened to Arafat. Abu Mazen, I don't believe he's going to play that role either. I don't think he can play that role. And he'll go through a process of demonization. Abu Mazen has already been called by the Israeli foreign minister Arafat without a uniform. So it's already happening. Now, I think he's being set up, Abu Mazen, for another generous offer. Barak's generous offer that Arafat supposedly refused, which is all a myth. There never was a generous offer. But that's part of the framing. has very little to do with actuality. Now we're going to get the same thing. Sharon's going to say to Abu Mazen, okay, I'm going to give you Gaza, and you know what? 60% of the West Bank, 70% of the West Bank. Now, what's interesting when you look at this is that the settlement blocks are 30% of the West Bank. Israel could give up the Jordan Valley block. It doesn't really need that. It could give up this little thing into Hebron. So it could shave the settlement blocks that it really wants to keep for control down to 20% of the West Bank. And you know what? It could shave, here and there a little bit as well. So Israel could give up 85% of the West Bank and never touch its settlement presence. Never. And Israel could give up 85% of the West Bank and keep control of the borders, keep control of the greater Jerusalem area, keep control of the water, control of the richest agricultural land, control of the freedom of movement of Palestinians, and of course, control of the airspace, control of the communication sphere. And that's the generous offer that I think is waiting for Abu Mazen. So if Abu Mazen says yes, I accept, two things are going to happen. One is he'll get the Nobel Peace Prize, and the other one is he'll get assassinated. And if he says no, you see, these Palestinians, again, they're refusing our generous offer. So it's really a setup. And it's our responsibility, I think, as part of the international civil society, to be the watchdogs, the ones that cry the emperor is naked, in order to expose this and not let it happen. The fourth element, and I'll do this very briefly, I'll finish this up. The fourth element in this matrix of control is the infrastructure, which is very important. Israel built during the Oslo time 29 major highways connecting the settlement blocks into Israel proper. You see? And a highway system costing $3 billion, all paid for by you. Completely paid for by the American taxpayer, and this is Clinton. So we can't blame Bush for it. So that what this does is, the two-state idea is based on a north-south axis. The idea that this is Israel and this is Palestine, more or less. To break that, to reconfigure the entire country, Israel created an east-west axis like this with the new Trans-Israel Highway. That's the new spine of the country. That then allows you to, for example, Ariel today is a part of the Tel Aviv metropolitan area. It takes about 15 minutes on a beautiful superhighway with no lights to drive from Ariel to the center of Tel Aviv. So this is now the Tel Aviv metropolitan area. This, of course, is the Modi'in metropolitan area that's developing. And that overlaps with the Jerusalem metropolitan area here. So in a sense, what we've done is we've made the West Bank that was once on the side, now this becomes the center of the country. The Israeli population moves eastward, the settlement blocks are integrated and coming from the east westward, and this becomes the new center of the country. And go detach a viable Palestinian state from that. And finally, the last element is the wall. The wall. Now, the wall, of course, is dramatic. It's horrendous. It's literally imprisoning entire people. Its cost in terms of agricultural land, of human suffering, of the division of families is just incalculable. But it's not the most important element of control. Basically, what the wall does is it comes to reconfirm the boundaries of the Bantustan that we just talked about. The wall is not a security wall, but that's the way it's sold, of course, and that's why most people accept it. Now, if cutting down on terrorism is a byproduct, that's fine. But the wall is intended to be a political border. And the logic is clear. It goes along the areas A and B. it hits a settlement block, it goes around the settlement block. Now, what Israel has just done again is in order to conform to the International Court of Justice ruling and to American pressure, supposedly, Israel has said, okay, we're going to make the wall closer to the green line, like this. But we're going to have a separate wall, fence, around the Ariel block. So in other words, this is simply not a part of the wall, and therefore it doesn't count. So it's all a fake kind of a thing. But in the end, the wall goes around the settlement blocks. It hugs area A and B again, goes around Greater Jerusalem. You see, so basically it sets the line of the Bantustan. So in the end, the bottom line is Jerusalem and the freedom of movement and agricultural land and so on. So this is the Bantustan that is likely to emerge. So finally, going back to the reframing for a minute, in terms of solutions, it doesn't matter what solution we talk about. What Israel is going to press for, any Israeli solution, will include leaving Israel in control of the entire country. It will include the fact that there's a Palestinian state, which allows Sharon to sign on to the roadmap, because Israel needs a Palestinian state to relieve itself of that population, but there won't be a viable Palestinian state. Any Palestinian state has to be a Bantustan. These are the essential parameters of any solution that Israel would agree to. In the approach that we're not advocating a particular solution. First of all, the Palestinians have to do that. And second of all, international law dictates the solution. International law says Israel has to go back to the 1949 armistice lines, or the Green Line. Occupied territory cannot be annexed, period. You can make certain adjustments. If the Palestinians agree that, the line should go this way, but in recompense we'll get a little bit of territory. If there's an agreement, you can do that. But the essential principle that Israel has to retreat to the 1967 lines is embedded in international law. There shouldn't be negotiations, even. So that in our human rights approach, any Palestinian state has to be viable, and viable is a key word. And what's important is the word viable is included in the roadmap. So that's a good piece of news. Any Palestinian state has to be viable and truly sovereign, and only a win-win approach that incorporates human rights and international law can resolve the conflict. And finally, after all of this, I would say that these are the critical questions that we have to ask of any peace process. And now we should have some of the tools to do that. Will this plan really end the occupation, or is it merely a subtle cover for control? Does the plan offer just a sustainable peace, or is it just an imposed quiet of a military power that's able to stifle any kind of resistance? Does this plan, whatever it is, really offer a Palestinian state that's territorially, politically, economically viable, or is it just a prison state? A state, a Bantustan that's really a prison? Does the plan address the refugee issue, which is crucial, and that's not something we can run away from? And does the plan offer regional security and development? I think a regional aspect is very important. So at any rate, I think that's where we are today, and in a way, we represent the international civil society. I don't represent, but part of the Israeli progressive civil society. You're part of the progressive, most of you, I guess, American International Civil Society. We are the only allies the Palestinians have. They don't have allies in governments. They don't have allies public is hunkering down. What's interesting is the Israeli public does not want the occupation. This whole idea of exclusivity really doesn't so much occupy the Israeli public. They would just as soon have the wall and separation and cut the Palestinians off our necks and let us get on with our lives, but are convinced by their leaders that there is no political solution. And therefore, in this kind of a situation, the only real allies that Palestinians have that can help them articulate what's going on, that can help monitor what's going on, that can be watchdogs, that can prod governments in the direction of a just peace is us. And so I think we have a responsibility to play a role. And just one last sentence, and that is, that's not only because we care about Palestinians, or Palestinians and Israelis as well, but because this conflict is emblematic. You know, like the South African struggle, that took on universal significance. Because the idea of having a country based on racism that's simply a normal part of the international system was absolutely intolerable. It sullied everyone. It made all of us complicit. And finally, the international community, because the governments wouldn't do that, the international civil society rose up in all kinds of ways and brought up governments with sanctions and other things to end apartheid. This is achieving, I think, is beginning to assume those proportions. That certainly in the Muslim world, the Palestinian issue is the litmus test. It's the essence of the way the West is treating Islam, the essence of neocolonialism. The link between this and Iraq is very clear, and the link between this, Iraq, and Iran is very clear. So that from the point of view of the danger that this conflict poses to all of us is something that should really light warning lights to us. But I think the other thing that's important, and from what I think Chris was saying about the organization against the war in Iraq, is that, you know, we're sort of at a juncture, a very critical juncture. Between those that represent the established world order, the representatives of power and domination and militarism and exploitation, you know, the Bushes and the Sharons and the others, versus this new world that we're trying to nurture. That is, it's true, it's a little further ahead in Europe than in this country, but that it's beginning to emerge, which is a world that's based on human rights and inclusiveness and universality and international law. And, you know, this conflict is the most transparent conflict that's ever been. I mean, it's right in our face, in the light of day, in the CNN cameras, and it's like a challenge to us. If, in our face, the occupation wins, and an entire people is actually imprisoned, literally imprisoned behind walls, and a new apartheid situation emerges, what are the implications for all the struggles that we're trying to relate to? What are the implications for our ability to really see a better world come about? So the stakes that we have in a way in this conflict are really tremendous. And I think they'll affect issues all over the world, because if we lose this, what is the message to peoples in other parts of the world that are much less in the spotlight in terms of their hopes of trying to achieve a world of equity? So I think that we really have to look at this conflict not merely as a conflict between, you don't have to be a Middle East wonk to get involved in this. I think it's in the interest of all of us to really ensure that the forces of power politics are defeated, and that a just peace based on human rights and international law win the day in Israel and Palestine. Okay.
clearly liked your talk. Before we begin our discussion, I just want to alert people to a couple opportunities you have. One is we do have copies of Jeff Halper's Obstacles for Peace for $20, and they'll be available over here. The Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions is able to carry out, which I'm sure Jeff will talk about more in our discussion, is able to carry out its work because we donate to it. And so after the discussion, if you'd like to make that kind of contribution, which is vitally necessary, Hassan Fuda will be over there in that little area over there and be able to talk to you about how you might do that. I do want to remind everyone about the March 19th demonstration against the war. There are leaflets available here, or we can arrange to get them to you. We need to build this in all of our community organizations, unions, on campus, wherever we can in the next. We only have 2 weeks to do it. But for any new folk who participates in this, while millions are demonstrating around the world, it's going to be one of the most empowering experiences of their life, and hopefully guarantee that they will be, from then on, part of our movement. Okay, we have some ground rules for discussion. We would just like to ask folks to restrict their questions or comments to 3 minutes. The goal of that, of course, is to allow everybody to have a chance to speak. I'll call on everyone a first time before I call on anyone a second time. And let's have a lively discussion. Yes, go ahead.
My question is, in regards to South Africa, is the implication of South Africa that a one-state solution is, really the vital option here? And isn't it easier in a certain sense to convince Americans that Israel needs to be a non-exclusive country defined by borders rather than a Jewish state than it is to imagine, which is kind of hard to do? I think the American population would go for 85% of the West Bank. It's already established that that's okay. It's already established that Arafat turned down a generous offer, and unless.
Can you please repeat the question a little bit? Okay, maybe we'll give a mic to. No, it has to do with the issue of the one-state solution. That seemed, if we're following the South African example to the end, in a way, what came out was one unitary state in South Africa. That makes, I like the one-state solution. I think it would be great, and I think it would be good for both peoples. And it's true, it would be the easiest thing to actually implement. We already have one state. The problem is, of course, that one state means the dismantling of Israel as a Jewish state. And from that point, which I have no problem with, I think that just like in South Africa, when it went to black majority rule, the Afrikaners and the other European populations didn't disappear. They kept their languages, they kept their institutions. They're a part of a pluralistic South Africa. So that you have a very vital Israeli culture, Israeli society, Israeli economy, institutions, and so on, that I think would prosper, actually. It would be really a challenge to integrate into the area. I can even make a good Zionist case for it. That the Zionist movement, in the very beginning, said, we really want to come home to the Middle East. That's the heart of our civilization. So the idea of building walls between us and the rest of the people in the Middle East, in some ways, is an anti-Zionist act. And I think in many ways, the challenge of really coming back and integrating would be, I think it's a very exciting proposition, actually. But, in the real politique of the world, I just can't see, it's something that might evolve someday, but I can't see it as an actual solution that you put on the table. Because I don't see the United States, certainly the Israelis won't agree to it. If the Israelis don't agree to it, then the United States won't agree to it, and other countries, of saying that Israel will cease to be a Jewish state and will become a state of all its citizens in a wider state. So I like the idea in principle, but it doesn't seem to me that it's doable, at least at this stage. Unlike South Africa, where it was clear that in other words, the idea of a Jewish state has a credibility that the idea of a white racist state in South Africa didn't have. I could say, I mean, it's, you know, that this is a Jewish racist state. You know, because again, the idea of exclusivity and tribalism and privilege, one population privileged over another, displacement, that's racism. But it's not framed in that way. And so I think it would be very hard to actually get that kind of a solution adopted in the real world. It just seems to me a non-starter.
Yes, in the back.
I think it's interesting to look at South Africa because the one-state solution, black majority rule, was never really on the table. What it was there was a mass rebellion in South Africa that overturned the existing apartheid regime. And up until that time, civil society, including the United States, which was happy to keep Nelson Mandela in jail for 27 years in Europe, were perfectly happy with the apartheid state. And really, the component, I think, is very important for a lot of us here who are organizing against the war, is the component of working people around the world who built the movement against the occupation. Because that is what is going to give the Palestinians the kind of international support to overthrow what is a two-state system. And I think the South African example is absolutely clear that you cannot have two separate states because they will be unequal. Ultimately, working people in Palestine and Israel will not be willing to tolerate it. And I think for those of us who are outside of Israel and Palestine, there should be no problem with us saying we're for a democratic secular Palestine, that we are against racist religious states. And I don't think that's stepping on the movement's toes there. My question for you is, given that Israel is creating these two different workforces, given what's happening on the ground in the area today, do you see any motion, any groups beginning to raise the idea of a democratic secular Palestine, which was the traditional Palestinian liberation positions?
Within Israel, you don't have. There's almost no voice like that. There's a few in the very left circles. I think in the Alternative Information Center, which is one of the very left groups, an anti-Zionist organization, you have that. But it's not at all part of the Israeli. It's not discussed even in Israel. I mean, it's sort of eliminated right away. I think among the Palestinians, I think there's a lot of support for that. And like you say, that was actually the position of the PLO for many, many years. There is, however, a certain reservation about rushing into that because of what you also said, Mike, and that is that because Israel is so much stronger than the Palestinians in terms of institutions and economy and so on, that there's a fear that if you rush in to one secular state, the Palestinians are liable to become an underclass in Israel, kind of a permanent underclass, and you perpetuate that inequality. So what a lot of the Palestinians, for example, Hassan Khatib, who was the Minister of Labor in the Palestinian Authority, who's written a lot about this, says that it should emerge, it should evolve to one state, but that the Palestinians need a period of time in which they can achieve they're not going to achieve absolute parity with Israel, of course, but in which they can achieve enough parity that when a kind of a union occurs, that they'll be able to cope with it, and they won't just be reduced to the underclass of that state. So again, I think in any way you look at it, whether it's economic or political or whatever, it's an idea that's very compelling and that might have its day as an actual solution. So we still need something for the shorter term or the middle term that's doable.
Yes, right, second row.
What are they doing with the new Romanians? Are they temporarily employed as immigrants, or do they become a problem for them? I mean, that's going to be a minority if they stay. What are they doing with these labor that they bring?
Well, the idea is, that's another whole other discussion, because the idea is, of course, they come in as foreign workers. They come in for a certain period of time. They have a contract, 6 months, a year, and then they go. And there's tremendous abuse of the foreign workers, which is why Chris mentioned Cabo, VED, and other organizations that are trying to work on the rights of foreign workers. But, what's happening is, to a certain degree, is what happened in Europe as well, is that they come and they don't all leave. Some of them marry, some of them stay for many years. There begins to be a process of normalization of their status, slowly.
Can they become citizens?
They can become citizens formally. I mean, formally, as a matter of fact, they have to leave the country. But there's all kinds of they hide out for years, and there's an amnesty sometimes, or they might marry an Israeli, or this or that. So in fact, over time, a certain number do become citizens. What's important to emphasize is that the Jewish majority in Israel is today down to about 70%. About 70% is the Jewish majority inside Israel, not including the occupied territories. In other words, you have more than 1 million, about 1,200,000 Palestinian citizens of Israel. You've got, the figures aren't exactly known, 300,000 to 400,000 Russian immigrants who aren't Jewish, who aren't going to become Jewish, who are trying to organize as ethnic Russians. And the Ministry of Interior refuses to register their association. And then you've got a good number, I don't know, I would say maybe 20,000 or so foreign workers who in one way or another have a permanent residency, if not citizenship in Israel. And then you have Israeli immigration. Now Israel doesn't include immigration in its figures. In Israel you have no such thing as immigration. In most countries, if you've left your country for 5 years or more, you're counted as an immigrant. The chances that you're going to come back are slim. In Israel, you don't do that, and the figures are secret. But it's estimated that between about 500,000 to 700,000 Israeli Jews have left the country permanently. I mean, certainly have a lot of Israelis probably in this part of the country too. So that if you put that all together, the Israeli majority is about 70%. And the problem with that, of course, is to maintain Israel as a Jewish state. And then, of course, you have to also take into account the fact that 75% of the Jews never went to Israel. So, the question is, can Israel represent itself as the Jewish state when the Jewish people overwhelmingly decided, no, you're not our state. We're very happy to be Americans and British and French and whatever we are. So that you're in the big obsession in Israel is a demographic issue. Because, what Israel has to do in order to impose itself as a Jewish state with a dwindling majority becomes more and more repressive. For example, just one quick thing, by law and by zoning go together, non-Jews are not allowed to live on 93% of the land of Israel. 93% of the country is reserved for Jews exclusively. So, and the Palestinian citizens of Israel represent about 17% of the population, but they're confined to about 3% of the land. So you've got these real tensions within the society that again are, I don't know, I think have to be taken into account. but which are making Israel more and more of a repressive society, certainly for its Arab citizens.
Yes, right there. Nabook, you.
My name is Luciano. I'm a South African. I lived through the apartheid era, and I know all about Bantu stunts and why they don't work. They certainly don't. And we all know as well that walls don't work either. The Berlin Wall is only a few years since that came down. Obviously, the apartheid system, the Bantu stunts and walls are not going to work in Israel either. But the wall come down has to. History bears that out. It seems to me that the unitary system would certainly be a utopian type of approach that would be wonderful if that could happen. But as you indicated, it's not likely to happen in the short term because there's no real popular support for that amongst the Jewish population in Israel, and very little support outside of Israel for that idea either. Certainly, there's some in the Palestinian area. But it does seem that the amount of territory that a Palestinian state is endowed with initially could be negotiated and could be agreed on if there's sufficient pressure on public support in Israel. In other words, to make the compromises, to make such an exchange valuable. I don't think 85% is a magic figure, maybe 95%, 97%. I don't know what the number is, but it seems like that could be a solution at least to get the process moving. And once people start getting living instability, then possibilities of two states under one kind of union, as has been done in other parts of the world, are possible. Like in the EU, like in the Mercosur countries in Latin America and elsewhere. So perhaps that's a step towards it. I'd just like to know from your point of view, how much actual PR is being done in Israel to the population in general to sort of really make a dual state work, to make the compromises. The people in these places like Ariel and other places like that.
Well, first of all, I think the Israeli government feels that it's one. I mean, Sharon, if I was Sharon surveying the landscape, I'd be pretty satisfied. I've got the Arafat out of the way, I have the Palestinians in a box, I have facts on the ground, I've got American recognition of my settlement blocks, I got 95 senators in my corner. I don't think Sharon sees any clouds on the horizon. I think the cloud he doesn't see is, again, the civil society, that I think will play, is increasingly playing a role. But, and so the Israeli public is not dealing with this. It's not an issue. It's very hard to convey how apolitical, in some ways, the Israeli public is. How much this isn't. The Israeli public, when it thinks of peace, it thinks of peace and quiet. It wants personal security, that's it. And it doesn't care about the Palestinians. So, basically, the Israeli public said to Barak, when he was elected in 1999, do it. Get us out of this mess. Get this albatross off our neck. We don't care what you do. You know what? Set up a Palestinian state. Get rid of all the settlements. We don't care. Just get us out of this mess. And Barak messed it up. And today, Barak, is a persona non grata. So they went to Sharon. They said to Sharon, do it. Whatever you got to do, we don't care. You want to load them on trucks and ship them out? We don't care what happens to Palestinians. They're not a factor in our consideration. Get us personal security. We don't care. And so there's an interesting disconnect. And that is that this whole policy of expanding settlements, expanding control, Bantuization, that's not coming from the will of the Israeli public. The Israeli public doesn't want the West Bank. But it's coming from the fact that the political leaders have told the Israeli public that there is no political solution. They just hate us. So they make a deal. The people say to the government, you know what, give us personal security, and we don't care how you do it. And the government says, okay, we'll bring you personal security, and then it follows its own plans and so on. And actually, if you ask an Israeli, I've done it. If you ask most Israelis, what do you want? What's the way out of this? Where are you going with this? They have no idea. They have no plan, not one state, not 10 states. They've never thought of it. They don't want to. They have absolutely not the foggiest idea of what they want, except they want personal security. But if you push them, they'll say, the only way out is a miracle. That's a political program with us. 48 was a miracle, 67 was a miracle. In other words, you know what the Israelis really want? I'll tell you, the Israelis want Bush to get up one morning and say to Sharon, the occupation's over. We love Israel, we'll defend Israel, but you have 6 months to get out of the occupied territories, period. And you would have, that would bring dancing in the streets of Tel Aviv. That's what the Israelis want. But it's not going to happen for all kinds of reasons. So the Israeli public is also hunkering down and feeling disempowered and just trying to find in a very desperate way this peace and quiet that sort of eludes it.
Could you touch on the Sharon Condoleezza Rice solution to absorbing the 400,000 refugees in Lebanon in 1559 and the pressure on Syria? And also the other part of my question is why the Middle Eastern government and the population are not rising into the issue of the Israeli nuclear weapons while the pressure is on Iran? Is this something clear as far as the Israeli 200 nuclear weapons? Thank you.
I'm not aware that there's a Condoleezza Rice Sharon agreement on the refugees.
In 1559, one of the issues, one of the items that is to settle the Palestinians in Lebanon and give them residence in this case and not closing them. And this is what
Within Lebanon.
within Lebanon.
Yeah, I don't think Israel completely just denies the refugee issue. I mean, that's not, Israel won't deal with that. And I think that, and as a matter of fact, what I didn't mention was that in the Bush-Sharon exchange, one of the articles was also that all the refugees would have to go into the Palestinian state. The refugees would not be allowed to come into Israel properly. So that the Sharon sort of closed that loophole at the same time. So not only is there a Bantustan, but the Bantustan now responsible. I mean, there's 4 million refugees or so. Not all will come back, but quite a few number of people will come back, which makes it even more difficult, which is why this issue of viability is so important. Let me just say one other thing here, and that is that I think we're in it's a very tricky kind of process that we're in, and maybe it's a little bit too sophisticated for us because we're kind of an unwieldy bunch. It's us, international civil society folk. And that is that, we can talk about, I am talking about the idea of a regional confederation. We can talk about the idea of a viable Palestinian state and then define what viable means. We can talk about all these things, but everything we talk about can weaken the Palestinian negotiating position. In other words, the Palestinians have, and they're not talking about Plan B. Because in a way, the Palestinians have to go into negotiations with their maximal position. And they have to go in with the idea that international law says that Israel has to get out of the occupied territories, period. Barak got very upset at Arafat because Arafat never came with a counter proposal. we start to talk about possible compromises before negotiations begin, then the Palestinians are going to come in from a very weakened position. At the same time, I think we know that Israel isn't going to withdraw the 1967 borders. So at some point, the Palestinian leadership is going to have to signal us, or signal distress in general, maybe, that now we really have to pull a plan B out of our pocket. And we have to take the initiative because if the Palestinians don't come with a plan B, which could be a confederation, it could be, they have to be ready for the contingency of not getting a viable state. Now what do you do? If they don't have a plan B, and they start scrambling, Israel's going to jump right into the vacuum and just gobble them up like they did in Oslo. So I think in a way, we have to support the Palestinian position and demands for complete withdrawal from the occupied territories, a Palestinian state in all the territories. And then we have to see, the moment that that's clear that it's not going to be, we have to sort of mobilize together with the Palestinians to try to advocate for what would be a viable solution. So we're kind of caught in a bind of not really being able to talk about all kinds of different contingencies because that's liable to mess up the Palestinians going into negotiations.
Okay, I'm going to recognize one from over here. This guy, wait, no, sir, wait. This guy's had his hand up first. Okay. Sure. I haven't seen a woman's hand. Okay. I'm sorry.
I'm very experienced at the results because I've been, as you mentioned, uniformly unsuccessful. What it means to accomplish such a mission. But I feel so frustrated because I don't know what I, as an ordinary citizen, can do other than to talk to friends and whatnot. But what is there that perhaps could be others to be a more constructive participant in this effort?
What can we do? What can all of you do? There's a lot of different levels of working here. It's hard to know. I've written all kinds of strategy papers and position papers, but an actual answer, all right, not go out and do this, I don't really have so much. Because, the normal thing is go talk to your members of Congress, go talk to your political representatives, and so on. But that doesn't help. Members of Congress will say, you can talk about human rights and national law, occupation, and stuff, but that's not the basis on which I vote. I vote on the basis of getting elected next time. And the Palestinian issue is not going to help me get elected. So in a way, your normal channels of influence are blocked. And I think in some ways, we've issued a call for sanctions and for divestment. Our committee, encouraged by the Presbyterian Church. It hasn't been passed by the church. I don't know if it will be, but it's been, the process has been initiated in the Presbyterian Church, calling for divestment of companies that profit from the occupation. And of course, we have the Caterpillar campaign. April 13th is a day of protest against Caterpillar. And so I would think that there should be a campaign to limit arms sales to Israel. The sales of American arms to Israel are absolutely in violation of the Arms Export Control Act. All of those sorts of things. So I think what a campaign of sanctions does, or maybe in a lot of our activities, what happened with South Africa, one of the things that happened was that the regime was gradually delegitimized. And a campaign of sanctions is a kind of a moral campaign. So if we can get the occupation and Israel's control of Palestinians so delegitimized, so unacceptable morally that it becomes more and more difficult to actually support it, like it became difficult to function within the apartheid environment. If companies begin to feel very uncomfortable having dealings with Israel, you know, you've got what somebody mentioned today, Textron in Providence, that makes the Bell helicopters, that are the Apache helicopters that made Providence, Rhode Island. The headquarters that make the Apache helicopters. So even a local campaign against that corporation here in Providence would, in other words, what I'm saying is that sometimes to focus on a key issue of the occupation, make that a campaign, and a campaign like that has a moral element to it that in the end, I think, discredits the occupation and makes it more and more difficult for members of Congress and other people to actually support it. It's a roundabout way, and yet there's an urgency here that is also. I don't have a good suggestion in terms of the urgency, except sanctions and the advocacy that I mentioned, the reframing and making our voices heard.
Before I recognize another, yes? Oh.
I think only one thing is that we'll do tonight is stop by and talking material.
I would just like to let you know, too, as the chair, that this meeting is sponsored by the Middle East Crisis Committee, the Right to Return Coalition, We Refuse to Be Enemies, all organizations that would love to have you join and get active with our efforts to educate the population in Connecticut and create that moral groundswell to help delegitimize the occupation, and that can be done. And now I'm going to recognize the woman in the second row.
Just in case you didn't, I don't know if you knew, Christine, the Connecticut Green Party is also.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please forgive me.
That's fine. Jeff, I very much appreciate your notion of reframing, but if you come back to human rights, the refugee issue is key, because it is at least in international law and has to be honored. It seems that so much of this we vow.
Want me to recognize you? You want to answer the question?
I just wanted to mention that We Refuse to Be Enemies also welcomes members, and they don't have to be either Muslims or Jews.
I mean, I don't know how you can say, well, Israel doesn't want in other words, it seems to me if we actually follow international law through, the solution would be obvious. You wouldn't, in fact, argue for a one-state solution because where would they go? Then, even that, in your argument, the Israelis may come back and just getting out of territories in order to not have to go to one state. So I don't see how you encourage people to refrain away and then opt out on that very important issue. It's like you're stepping back from your own very good, argument. And moreover, the refugee issue is something that I think people, the idea that people get to go home, it has to be talked about, and that's what people shy away from. That seems to be the heart of the concept that brings you back to 48 and brings you back to not the occupation. And that seems to me to be eating away at the society as well.
All right, very briefly, you know by now I didn't mention, for the reason we talked about, because I can't really advocate for a solution, I think, is not being a Palestinian, but I can certainly put some ideas into the ring. And I think the two-state solution is wrong. The one-state solution is not going to happen, at least in the middle range, and so on. So what? And that relates to all these other issues of refugees and other things. I think I just had an article that came out in Tikkun magazine that you can look up on the internet, which is a most Jewish magazine here in the States, about what I call the two-stage solution. And I think what's missing from all the discussion is a regional dimension. And that is that They live in Lebanon and Syria, there's a diaspora. If you talk about the water issue can't be resolved. A lot of the water comes from Syria and Lebanon and Turkey. If you talk about economic development, if you talk about democratization, all these kinds of issues are really regional in scope. And one problem is that even if there was a perfect peace between Israel and Palestine, and these two countries develop wonderfully, if they develop in a region that's poor and autocratic and so on, then it's not good. It's not. You have to have a more even regional approach, I think, to this issue. So, and you're not going to dismantle the occupation. So what I would do, what I would suggest, just to kind of throw this into the ring or whatever, into the pot, is a two-stage solution that separates the issue of viability from the issue of sovereignty. I would say, now this is, just saying this. Say to the Palestinians, this is basically what you're going to get. Maybe we'll flesh it out a little bit here and there. You're not going to get a viable state. But at least the state, whatever it is, gives you a political identity, gives you a citizenship, gives you a parliament, you're in the UN. Okay? I would suggest taking something like this, a little bit better than this, not exactly this, but a little more fleshed out, the 85%, let's say, on condition that there's a second stage, that the international community guarantees in blood, and that is that within a reasonable period of time, let's say 5 to 10 years, a regional confederation emerges. It's a European law of Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and maybe Syria and Lebanon by then, which in many ways recreates the cultural, geographic, economic unit of that part of the world anyway. And in which, like in Europe, you have citizenship in your particular country, but you're free to live and work throughout the whole I call it a Middle East Union. Within the whole region, you have the right to live and work. What that would do is it would give the Palestinians a political identity, but it would neutralize the issue of how big the state is, what the borders are. After all, in Europe, you have Luxembourg that exists next to Germany. Denmark that exists, near France. So if you have this union idea, it doesn't matter. The fear of the Palestinians is being locked into this prison state. Well, if you can break them out of that and say you can live and work throughout the region as Palestinian citizens, then you've given them their individual choice. Refugees can go live wherever they want to. They can go home, literally. But they go back as Palestinian citizens. So that Israel's fear of losing its Jewish character. I mean, Israel still has control of its citizenship. At the same time, you've got the whole country would be integrated. So you don't dismantle the settlements. I mean, to dismantle Maliya and maybe these big settlement cities is impossible. It's not going to be done. But you can neutralize it. Because in a Middle Eastern Union, the whole union, the whole region is integrated. So if it's integrated, it loses its controlling aspect. So I think the idea of a Middle East Union is something that would give a certain strategic depth to this whole issue, and allow us to find a balance, like Europe. I think there's all kinds of problems, but the balance between a nation state with its own identity and citizenship and parliament and self-determination, and at the same time the freedom to live and work throughout the region. Many Palestinians live in Jordan, and they're rooted in Jordan. Now they want the Palestinian identity, they want their citizenship, they want to vote, but they might not want to go live in Ramallah because they've lived in Amman for the last 60 years, and that's where their kids are. respects the integrity of each of the different states, but it doesn't allow any of the states to exercise that exclusivity and privilege that you have today with Israel. So it's just another line of thought that I think we can.
We've been going for 2 hours, and I think that I would suggest that we formally break now. I invite all you to stay.
Question, he had his hand up for a long time.
Okay, well, yes, well, I see many hands. I'll let this brother speak, and then we'll formally break. We'll let Jeff answer, and I invite you to stay for informal discussion. Please talk to Hassan if you can make a contribution for rebuilding houses, and see that guy Jason for leaflets for the demonstration. Okay.
I love the idea of the union, and I'm wondering if we were to push the one-state solution, would that drive Israel toward the union, or at least toward a two-state solution?
Right.
No, that's one idea of bringing up the idea of a one-state solution. It would scare Israel to such a point that it would say, okay, we need a Palestine. That, in fact, is discussed in Israel. Shimon Peres also says that Israel needs a Palestinian state in order to keep a Jewish state. That's an idea, but who knows if that would actually work.
Let's give a tremendous thanks for Dr. Halper.
Giant speak. I just wanted to say that We Refuse to Be Enemies welcomes everyone as members. You don't have to be Muslims or Jews.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.